Procrastination is a real problem for the artist. One of the keys to getting better at art, to improving your craft, is simply to do a lot of it, to practice doing the things that we want to create. This could be illustrations, comic books, sculpture. You could be trying to build your folio. You could be trying to work on your fundamentals, your perspective, your rendering. Whatever it is, often just doing that will obviously help us. And procrastination is one of these things that gets in the way, where we know we want to do these things, we're dedicated, and yet when we sit down to do it, it just doesn't happen. I certainly spent my fair share of time playing way too many video games and just ignoring the fact that I wasn't really creating a lot of art. I think my career personally would have been a lot further along if I figured out how to solve a lot of these problems I had with procrastination early on. Now, the idea of procrastination, though, is quite interesting. I think there's a lot of subtle things that are going on from many different levels, both on the mental side and the philosophical side, and also a lot of really core undercurrents of how we view time and productivity as a culture. And also there's just a lot of practical things you can do. Often, in order to do great things, to create a lot of stuff, to be productive, it's just a matter of building good habits. So there's many different angles here and many things that we can do to improve our overall productivity and really try and get ahead of these concepts of procrastination. And what I want to do on this episode is dive in and look at the 3 things that I think really helped me to get over a lot of my own procrastination. And we're going to look at it from a couple of different perspectives, and hopefully this will give you some ideas and strategies to figure out how to get over some of your own procrastination. I think this is a really important thing for artists because we're often sitting there in our head, and often these feelings can be very, very disruptive. The feeling that you know you should want to do stuff, but yet you kind of can't quite do it. It just hits at the core of creativity and a lot of these stories we tell ourselves as artists. Welcome to the Visual Scholar Podcast. My name's Mcburnie. I've been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and on this show, we're all about demystifying the worlds of art, creativity, and productivity so that you can get better faster and enjoy your artistic journey. So, this idea of procrastination is, I think, something that is multi-layered when it comes to art. I think that there's many, many reasons why we either sit down to draw or to create, and we simply just don't have the motivation or the inspiration. Or that you maybe think about it and you kind of want to do it, but we're often not quite sure what we want to do. And there are many of these aspects that seem to combine where we just don't have the impetus, and it can be really hard to tell what's going on. So I'm going to come at this from a couple of different perspectives, but just understand that in general, there's many reasons why you may feel as if you don't like to draw. And it can be because often you just don't really have a good idea of what you should create. And often we do have ideas in the week, when you're not actually sitting down. But then when you actually sit down to do the thing, you're not quite sure. You've sort of lost that inspiration. You've lost that motivation. I think there's often these ideas that are linked to, the metaphor of the creative muse, of staying inspired and motivated, that can very much intersect with this idea of sort of procrastination. And procrastination, I think we can look at this idea, which again, I think is linked to these things that we feel, but often I think it may be important to kind of dissect some of these so that we can get a bit more fidelity there and really understand what's going on. Because I think for artists, it's a little bit different. But typically procrastination in the wider sense is where the deadline is ticking down and we're just not handling the task early on. So we're leaving it until the deadline is, just around the corner, and then we kind of dive in, just before all of the time has run out, and it kind of puts a lot of pressure under us. And so the idea of procrastination often puts a lot of pressure and deadline intensity onto whoever's performing the task. And we often deal with this a lot in school. We often procrastinate doing assignments and essays. People often procrastinate doing things for work. If you've been freelancing, it's a very common thing. I've done this a lot where I know the deadline's coming, but I kind of leave it to the last minute. I think there's something to the creative spirit that does like doing things under pressure, doing things on deadline. And it's not a one-to-one situation where procrastination is 100% bad. I think what we're going to talk about is some different ways to look at it here, but also that it's not necessarily the worst thing. And I think that the first thing that I would say is that the number one mistake we tend to make is that we view the fact that we're feeling procrastination and we're engaging in it as this like really bad thing that, we need to whip ourselves on the back about and really sort of get down upon. And it can feel as if we are, failing at something really fundamental, especially when you are an artist and you feel as if this is your calling and you want to be creative and every part of your being is trying to do this. And when your inspiration fails you, or the impetus to get started early fails you, it really does feel as if like maybe I'm not meant to be doing this. Maybe I should give up. Maybe this is not right for me. And I think that's one of these things where the more information you can get about this and the more you can really understand how your personality intersects with what's going on and how this relates to a lot of our cultural assumptions about time and energy and effort and a lot of the training that you probably received if you received a Western education, like a pan-Western education. There's a lot of presumptions about how we perform and what happens when we actually sit down to do a task. So I think this is nuanced. The first thing before we really jump in, though, I'd say is don't freak out if this is happening to you. I think there's a lot of really good reasons why we do procrastinate. And as artists, I think this is often our subconscious telling us that, something's wrong or that often we're geared towards and we have a lot of habits that are just kind of making this happen. And there's not some solution that you're going to find where instantly you can turn this off because it's connected to a lot of us feeling what's going on. It's been said that writer's block, which is a form of procrastination, is often your subconscious mind kind of telling you that maybe there's something wrong with your story, that maybe, you shouldn't sort of move forward with it. And that often if you do kind of think your way through it, that will sort of disappear. And often you can think your way through it by just writing anyway. There's many different strategies people have for overcoming it, but I think the impetus that's there and the desire to, potentially put off until, it's the last minute and we have that sort of deadline pressure can be just a fundamental part of our creative nature and our desire for that feeling of creativity and being put under pressure and not sort of worrying about stuff quite so much because we just kind of have to get it done. So I think there's a lot of interesting things we can glean about creativity and about being an artist from the simple, annoying thing that is procrastination. The first thing that I think really helped me to understand this was just going a little bit deeper into what procrastination really is and how people often sort of talk about it. So firstly, I would just want to discuss some of the more philosophical, sort of intellectual sides of this, because I think often there's a lot of little tricks and habits and things that you can get going to really just kind of bypass this. And if you have a good habit or a couple of things that really work for you, what you find is you can just develop tools that are really simple to kind of just kickstart your way off. And often these can be mental games that we play. A really good one that people have sort of talked about is that, perfect is the enemy of good. And this is this idea that you kind of can't achieve perfection as an artist. And really you just need to kind of get on with it and create things, even if they're not perfect, that often, if you just kind of get on with it, it'll be good. And maybe that's sort of good enough. And I think often if you just kind of repeat these little mantras or these things, whatever it is that works for you, you can obviously just get over that hump, right? And often what we're dealing with is this friction point with procrastination where we sit down or we contemplate sitting down and we're kind of having worlds collide. We're seeing worlds collide where this is the thing we wanted to do. I'm going to create my illustration. I've had aspirations and ideas and inspirations and motivations about creating this illustration. I sit down to create it. And this is where the reality starts. The rubber meets the road, right? Reality starts to occur. And I think the degree to which your expectation of how being creative and sitting down to make art, the difference between that and what it actually feels like to do that, I think is the biggest culprit here. So there's a couple of really simple tactical things that we'll sort of talk about in the end, where you can sort of just kind of run through that friction point, right? Almost with your eyes closed and just kind of like start making stuff. There's a lot of things where you can mentally reframe it to just be like, oh, okay, I'm just being a perfectionist. I just need to kind of move forward. I just need to, get on with it. And that will work, and you will kind of overcome that. But what I want to do first is look a little bit deeper at why I think some of these procrastination feelings come up, like why you sit down to do the thing you want to do and you just don't do it, right? The first thing that comes to mind, and the thing that really I think tripped me up, and I think trips a lot of people up, is just coming from the Western educational paradigm, where you are kind of taught to really focus on the exam, on the test. And I think the logical thing there is when you're trying to acquire knowledge about, let's say, mathematics or something that's really knowledge-based, often the best solution is to acquire knowledge. You don't necessarily want to just sit down and write the essay. There are often things you can do to prepare for the actual act of creation that can really help, and often we're sort of trained to do that. And I think also because we're not trained in the act of creation, we often don't get a really good picture in sort of school, either primary school, high school, even tertiary education, of like, what are you meant to feel as you approach the creation process? What does it feel like when you actually start creating? And then how do you view the work after? And I've said this a lot because I think it really is the key to a lot of creation, is that the way you view the work before you start is very different to the way you view the work as you're creating it. And that's very different to the way that you view it after you've created it. And this is a matter of the expectation, the ideas, and then often the process of creating it. Like when you actually stop thinking about it, you start doing it, you're really just looking at the present. Like, what can I actually do now? How can I make this image better? I've got a blank page. Let's add something to it. Let's improve it. And then, oh, that didn't quite work. What am I doing here? We're very much in flow. We're very much not looking at or thinking about those other things. And so it can feel very weird for people when you're kind of maybe used to something that's more performance-based, like writing an essay where you really kind of can get it right or create something that is going to fit a series of expectations that someone has. So you're writing an essay on Shakespeare for your, sort of high school English class or something like that. There's, even though you could, and ideally the essay would have a lot of different ways it could be really good, there is often a set defined way that you should write that essay. And really, if you kind of think about it, you listen, you do the research, and you kind of write it how the teacher wants, that's when you're going to get your high marks. Creation is very different when we're dealing with art, because often there's no set outcome. There's no one telling us what to do. And so we're just a little bit unprepared for what this feels like. And so I think it does make a lot of sense to kind of procrastinate and say, well, like, the more I can prepare for this act of creation, the better. And often we take it too far and we leave it a little bit too long. But the real thing that often I think people are not expecting is if you do create and finish the work early, you're going to have a very different feeling when it comes to looking at the work, because you have a chance to step back and see it and understand what you've made. And that for a lot of people can be terrifying, because often it's a lot more fun to just kind of finish it at 3 a.m. and then not really even think about what you've made and just feel as if you've sort of achieved something just by the act of creating it. So there's many different reasons why I think we kind of approach the world this way, and why art seems even more like this, because art has this really fickle creation process that I think is unlike what a lot of other people have kind of experienced with other types of tasks. So we often go into creating art and we're taking a lot of the words that we use and patterns that we use from learning how to write essays or how to do exams in school, and we're sort of applying them to what's happening with art. And I think it's really important to kind of maybe separate out some of those and just look at what is the creative process. And this is where I think it is important to have a lot of that pressure and a lot of that energy that comes from the deadline. And I think this is often what we're trying to do when we do procrastinate, is to create a lot of energy, a lot of creative energy, a lot of stress, a lot of pressure on ourselves. And that does actually often help people to perform a little bit. And there's a sense to where often, even though people hate it, they also like that kind of last minute deadline and the procrastination, and the sort of pressure it puts on them is sort of good in some ways. The problem obviously is this frequently will backfire on you, and you get into these habits and patterns of creation that can be very disruptive. So I think it's important, though, to look at what's happening as kind of sensible, right? Often we are looking at the creations and the things that we want to make, and often it is very confronting to actually have to start making them. So I think it's really important to have a good process to your art where you kind of know where you're going to start, and you know what's going to happen after you do that step and what's going to happen after the step. The more you can sort of visualize what the actual act of creation is going to be like, the better. If you're just staring at a blank page, it's very easy to procrastinate. If you haven't really built into your routine and your artistic ritual a lot of on-ramps and ways to, sort of start that process off and, figure out, okay, what exactly am I doing? Do I already have a sketch here that I'm going to finish illustrating? Do I know where I'm going to go? Do I know how long it's going to take? This can often be another thing, is if you don't really know when it's going to end or what's going to happen, there's so many unknowns that we tend to freeze up, we tend to kind of stop. And I think there is something where we have to listen to what's happening there and try and help ourselves along a little bit. So it's not just a matter of like solving this and sort of getting over it, and this idea of procrastination just being this annoying thing that you can make go away by just being sensible and kind of doing stuff in the beginning. I think with creation, you do have to listen and look at the emotions involved and the expectations involved and the process involved, and understand that often procrastination is happening for a very good reason. It's often because we don't have the systems around our creative process to make sure we go into that process really nicely. And we often, haven't practiced the overall process enough where we feel confident that we're going to sit down and things are going to really work out. The more times you do sit down with some crazy idea and you start to create, and then it doesn't go well because you didn't really have a plan, or you don't know what to draw, and you haven't got some systems set up around what to draw and how to deal with that. And then the more you kind of build the frustration and the habitual sort of Pavlovian response to sitting down and feeling tension and a lack of creativity. So a lot of these things can be solved both, I think, by ironically, it's like appreciating that procrastination is kind of happening for a reason, not trying to distance ourselves from this aspect of ourselves, which is, I think, just being fairly sensible. And try and understand that I think if we're a little bit kinder to ourselves and we set ourselves up for success, then we're more likely to have success when it comes down to just kind of having a cool idea, sitting down to doing it, and then being really sort of inspired and motivated at that point where you sit down, because you know that you kind of have a way to kind of get into the rhythm. And as we'll talk about, you've got a couple of tools in your toolkit for if you don't feel like it, what can you do? And then you kind of know what are the stages and the steps you're going to go through with your creative process. I think the more you do this, the less you kind of see that real friction point between sort of starting and stopping. And I think a lot of that friction point does come from the way we have been trained and the way we sort of do think about these things, and just sort of bad habits that we can develop. So yeah, I think the first thing is just intellectually to appreciate procrastination as part of us, as like a part of the instinctual way that we interact with like having to perform some really important task like art. And to understand that the solution is not to kind of cut it off or like kill this thing or sort of destroy this thing, to view it as some enemy, but just to understand this is a natural response. And that if we sort of set ourselves up right, we give ourselves plenty of tools, that, this is just something where, it's just going to be another signal, right? And it's going to be a signal maybe that you haven't prepared enough, or that you don't really know where you're going, or that, like maybe there's something else on your mind. And it's not going to be this do or die situation where, if you sort of don't start now, you're going to spiral into this procrastination whirlpool of despair where the longer you put it off, the more you sort of stop doing it, right? So again, I think it's important to, funnily enough, appreciate what procrastination means to you and to really understand why it's happening. So for instance, for me, when I was, in my very early 20s and I was playing too many video games, and I knew I wanted to do this art, but I just kind of couldn't do it. And I would find other distractions and other reasons to not make art. And even when I had a lot of professional jobs on, I would really struggle to just do them sensibly at a certain time. What I've sort of come to understand is that I do really like the performance aspect of art and some of the uncertainty there. And I do kind of like the energy around being on a deadline. And that's kind of a part of me. So what I've sort of done is just instead, I used to really view the procrastination as like an evil aspect of myself, right? Like this is something to be destroyed. And I think now what I try and do is build my creative process around having a good, sort of sense of time pressure when I am creating. And I often find I'm much more productive and I engage in less procrastination when I just kind of have more stuff on. So if I kind of like just make up another project, right? If I'm working on a particular deadline or something, I often just make up something else that I want to do. And it sounds really silly, but this is one of these tactical things where I do that and then I feel as if I don't have any of that time anymore and I'm kind of pressed for time. And yeah, it just kind of magically works. And it's not that I did anything drastically different, but the more I build habits around that and just make sure that, if I'm not feeling it, it's not that, procrastination striking, it's the end of the world, and, this is it. It's just that like, maybe I'm not feeling it right. Maybe I should just go through my checklist and just figure out, okay, what do I need to create this? Is maybe this feeling I'm having just telling me that I'm not quite ready to take this task on yet? Or maybe it's just too complicated. That always, for me, was a big thing, is I'd just be like, this just feels overwhelming. And when it feels overwhelming, for me personally, I can't break it down. I don't really know what I'm going to do when I start. And that's where, I just be like, okay, grab a bit of paper, I chunk it down into like simple steps. And then I'm like, okay, well, I'm not doing all this stuff. All I have to do is sit down and do this one thing. And then that kind of gets the ball rolling. And again, it's not some drastic change in myself. I still have a lot of those feelings, but it's having the tools and the habits and just that sort of mental framework of not to kind of freeze up and engage in sort of self-loathing about it that really kind of helped me to, again, I'd still deal with this stuff all the time, but I got way more tools and, in most cases, it's just not a problem. So the second thing that I think really helped me was to redefine success. And this is something that I often talk to people who are students who are taking some of the courses that I run, or who I've talked to who are going through, large university degrees, and we're trying to teach them basic drawing and fundamentals. And often there is an element of productivity in that, where I'm always trying to teach people like, here are some tools to actually get things done. Because it's one thing to just say, hey, here's the information on how to draw. It's another thing to really help someone get better at doing it and understand the nuances of the artistic process and how productivity relates to that. So one of the things that I've really found is often when we are sitting down to create, that we don't really even know what success means. And I think this is where when you push the deadline back and you procrastinate, you kind of redefine for yourself what success means. At some point, a little voice pops up and says, if you don't finish this right now, if you don't start it right now, you won't finish it. And then all these terrible things will happen. And I think that really gives you a much clearer vision of what success means. Success means you just scrape this thing across the line you finish it in any way, shape, or form. You're like, it's 3 a.m. You're in high school or something, or you've got some freelance project that, maybe just not quite sure how to do it that well, or it's not super inspiring for you, but, you kind of agreed to do it, like whatever. There's a million reasons why, it can be a real challenge to kind of engage yourself creatively. And a big part of being a professional is having tools as well to be like, okay, this project is something where I'm having a hard time getting my head around it. Like, how can I really become excited about this image, about this illustration or concept or whatever it is, to the point where, I'm not feeling as if this is work. I'm really feeling as if this is something inspiring, right? There's a lot of these mental games that we play where success is, I think, at the real crux of what we need to define. And I think there's many tools. Procrastination, I think, is often actually a tool to help you define success as, like, even if this thing is terrible, at least you finished it. And, then the worst case scenario doesn't occur. And it's much trickier to get up at 5 a.m. and, have to work on your art, which I know a lot of people have to do if you're doing this more as a hobby, or you're really trying to build extra skills and, that's the only time you've got. It can be really hard to sort of get up and be like, well, yes, I only have a short amount of period of time, but like, what should I actually do? Like, I'm sitting down to draw. What should I do? Like, what should I be doing? Like, what even is good drawing, right? We start to ask ourselves more questions about what we're doing, and I think go deeper philosophically, right? Like, stare into the abyss when we have much more time available to us and there's not that pressure. And I think the real key here that I found is to make sure you have a clear picture of what success means, no matter what you're doing. And I think this is where, if you get good at this, this is tricky because you really are getting into some mental gymnastics, right? But I think if you get really good at this, you can create a lot of the same pressure that you would have with a deadline just by kind of redefining what success means. And so what do I mean by that? It means that when you sit down, think about, like, what is the outcome you're trying to achieve? This can be really easy if you obviously are just trying to complete an illustration. Someone's paying you to do it because you're a professional artist and you have a deadline. You can see that really gives you a clear set of outcomes that you're trying to achieve. You kind of know the quality that you need to achieve with your illustration or your concept art or your work. You have a clear indication that your goal is to get good feedback from your art director or whoever you're working with, your client, and you're kind of like focused. It's really quite easy. And again, what failure means is also a part of what success means, right? So if you're thinking about success, the other side of that coin is failure. Like, what does failure mean? And how does procrastination help you or stop you from achieving that? When you're working professionally, failure means you really upset your client or your art director. You don't hand in the work, which causes trouble for everyone down the production line. You may not get paid. You may not get work again from those people, and they may tell all their friends, and you may never get any work again, and which means you will starve, and terrible things happen. So it's really easy, I think, professionally, and this is why artists, I think, often do improve quite well when they do become professionals and start just kind of working and getting on that treadmill, because you've got such clear goals and such clear versions of what success means. So I think this is much more challenging if you're a student, if you're kind of trying to make your own project, if you're trying to learn on your own. There's so many variables that can go into thinking about what is good. And I think this is where having a clear set of outcomes is really important. So what does that mean? Okay, it's like, okay, dude, it's okay to say that. What are we actually talking about? So I think that's where you have to sort of look at, okay, what am I doing? Am I creating a finished piece? Is this meant to be like a hero image for me? The best thing I've ever done? How long am I going to spend doing it? Is this me just kind of practicing stepping through the process? Am I sitting down for one session of 1 hour, 2 hours, maybe 3 hours, like whatever it is for you that really gives you that good sense of completion? But are you just kind of making art for your personal edification, just so you feel good? This is often what I'll do. I'll just sit down and I'll be like, I have 3 hours. I'm going to make something. It's not going to be the best thing I've ever made, but I just really want to make art. Other times I'm sitting there with a sketchbook and I have half an hour. Other times you might see, I really want to work on my rendering. I really want to draw something that's going to help me understand perspective. I'm going to work on my construction. I'm going to work on learning the Loomis method for constructing heads, or I want to learn anatomy. Whatever it is, there's often a goal here. And it's either a goal in terms of this is the thing we're making, or this is the skill that I'm trying to achieve. And I think it's really important when you're dealing with like an outcome to, make it clear. And I think when you have like, okay, I'm making an illustration, it's pretty easy to have a good outcome there and understand what success means. But it is important to understand, what is your expectation for the amount of time you're going to put in? Are you going to feel as if you're a failure if this isn't the best thing you've ever done? That's not possible if you're only spending a couple of hours doing it. And likewise, if you're just sitting down, and often this is what people really struggle with in the beginning, is I just don't even know what to draw. I'm trying to get better. What do I do? And I think this is where you're better off defining success often as spending a particular amount of time doing something, or just creating a certain amount of something. So taking some of the success away from this is the best thing I've ever made, or this is amazing art, because I think especially in the beginning, that's really, really challenging. It's important to say, well, okay, I'm going to sit down for half an hour. And if I sit down and I draw for half an hour or 2 hours or whatever it is for you, if I sit down and I draw for X amount of time, that is success. It doesn't matter whether the drawings are good. It doesn't matter whether I create something that's better than the last one. I don't need to move the needle. I just need to sit down and draw. Because often in the beginning, we're just struggling to actually get stuff done. And I think setting some times like this, where your goal is just to sit down for half an hour and do it, is really good. This will also train you to get over that initial hump, which again is something we'll talk about in the next section, where we really get sort of more practical. But often one of the best ways to kind of overcome that friction point where you sit down is just to say, you know what, I'm just going to sit down and I'm going to start working on this for half an hour. And I have no idea how long it's like. This often is a problem when you have a large project in front of you, or you're just trying to get better at anatomy or something. And I think it's good to just say, okay, I'm just going to sit down for half an hour. And if I sit down for half an hour and I do it, at the end of that 30 minutes, that's success. That's like a full 100%, like 100 out of 100. That's a tick, that's a win, that's a sticker, whatever it is for you that defines success, right? If that's sort of something that motivates you, that equals success, and that's all that matters. The other thing you could do is say, today I'm going to create 5 pages of sketches, or I'm going to create one page of thumbnails, or whatever it is, like a particular quantity that you're going to create. And again, in that case, if you make 5 pages of sketches and maybe one of them is okay and 4 of them are terrible, and a couple of them are really, really bad, that's fine. Why? Because success is that you sit down and you do it. And I think having this attitude as a tool to just be like, I'm just going to sit down and do it, is actually one of the best ways to overcome a lot of procrastination. But it's also one of the best ways to build a habit and to really get good at feeling good when you sit down to create. And I think this is often the real key. The more you feel as if I'm just going to sit down, I know what I'm doing, I'm just sitting here and I'm drawing for an hour, 2 hours, whatever it is. And it doesn't matter whether it's good. It doesn't matter whether it's the best thing I've ever done. I'm just going to sit down and do it. And that's just going to build that muscle, right? It's going to build that muscle of sitting down, feeling good. And then at some point, like I've achieved something. So these versions of success, I think, are really, really key. The other thing I think is, if you are trying to achieve something that's more finished, is to have a really clear expectation of what the quality is. And again, this is really simple. Are you working on it for 40 hours? Is this a situation where you're trying to make something really amazing, but you're going to do the first 5% of it? Having a good expectation and defining success in the beginning is really, really important, because this is what builds that positive relationship with sitting down to draw, feeling as if you're making good improvement and strides, not in the quality of your work, but just in your ability to sit down and do it. And if you do this over time, what you'll find is that habit of doing it will actually build a lot of the quality. And even though we're focusing not necessarily on quality, we're trying to just go for volume and quantity, that, in the long run, you just get a lot better overall. I think for me personally, this is what really tripped me up in the beginning, is I would kind of know that early on, there was no way I was going to be able to make this thing good. But I had as a definition of success for myself that all of this art that I was doing on a comic book, right? The first comic book I created, the Seven Pirates book, my real expectation was that I should be a professional artist and this should be the best book anyone's ever made, right? Like that's my expectation. That's my goal. And I think this is where these ideas of procrastination and perfectionism, I think it is really tricky, the idea that, perfect is the enemy of good. It's a good tool. But on the other hand, like, what if you do want it to be perfect? And I think it is really important to respect the aspects of ourselves as artists that do want to constantly strive and make it really good. And that you're not going to get really, really good if you're not trying to make it perfect every time. I think often the key is just to understand, like, what is the expectation there? Like, what are you actually expecting to happen? And I think if you don't have the ability, if you don't have the skills, if you're pacing yourself on some imaginary version of yourself that doesn't exist yet, and you don't have a way to feel good about the steps you're making along the way, about the journey, then it's very hard, because often procrastination, this was the irony of it, is often me feeling that way stopped me from actually doing stuff. And because I didn't do stuff, I got better way less. If I just chilled out, I think, and just done more work and just put one foot in front of the other, I think I probably would have improved a lot. But there is something to be said for having a high standard for ourselves and wanting that perfection. So this is another one of those things where you have to aspire to great things as an artist, but also you have to appreciate where you are and measuring those gaps and appreciating how far you've come and how the work you're doing right now is good. And then just looking at, like, instead of, just looking at how we're deficient based on our ultimate goals, the thing that I got good at was just appreciating that, 1% of improvement, right? Every page. Like, can I focus on one thing on this page and really try and make sure it's okay? I'll just make sure I don't get the eyes, right? I'd always do this where I'd be like, I draw a face and one of the eyes would be too low versus the other one, and it always look a bit like lopsided. And I just be like, oh man, again, like, why am I doing that? So, instead of trying to say, okay, this has to be the best page, I just be like, damn it, I'm just going to make sure that the eyes line up, right? And that's what I'm going to do. And I think just, having these little versions of like what success would be sort of really helped me to overcome that. And this is nuanced, right? You do have to appreciate the different things that you want. And some people are much more perfectionist than others, right? And some people have different aspirations for what they want out of their art. And sometimes, perfection is what we need to aspire to, but you have to appreciate where you are in your artistic journey and what you actually want to define as success for yourself right now when you're actually going to sit down and do it. So lastly, I want to talk about some real sort of practical, tactical stuff. And I'll go over a little bit more of this when we do some takeaways, but I think from a practical standpoint, often when we're dealing with procrastination, and I really want to talk about like the capital P procrastination, where, and this often happens with students that I see, we'd sort of talk, we'd go through the term or the semester, and then they obviously have a big break coming up. And people are often a little bit frustrated with the progress they've made. They've kind of tried really hard and some of it hasn't worked. And often, they've got things that they want to do and experiment more with, or like try again, like they're like, I know I didn't do that well on this assignment, but I'm really interested in it. I'm going to try really hard to learn those skills in the break. Or, we have these delusions of grandeur. Often when we have these breaks, people are like, I'm going to fill up like 10 sketchbooks, or, I'm going to go plein air painting, or, I'm going to draw a whole comic book, or whatever it is, right? I'm going to post every day on my blog or on Instagram. And then you kind of come back the next semester and you're like, oh, how'd that go? And they're like, yeah, I didn't do any of it. I tried the first day. I failed on the first day. And then I just watched Netflix and played video games for the rest of it. It's like, okay, right. And that's typically often the trap that we fall into, right? And I think one of the best tactical things you can do when you're really sort of struggling to just kind of get it happening, right? So again, when we do takeaways, I'll talk about some really sort of practical things you can do. Like I was saying, where if you just kind of sit down and do it and just start doing it, then often that will just work. But that's often not the problem. The problem is larger than that. If you're really struggling with this, where you have big aspirations, and it's not just that you kind of sometimes you don't feel like it, and sometimes you don't do as much work as you want, and sometimes you skip it, but like you really want to be an artist and you just haven't done it for 6 months, right? Or you just go weeks and months without drawing. So the most important thing is to define success, but set the goalpost way back. Really make sure that success just means you're sitting down and you're doing it in any way, shape, or form. This is like the most important tactical thing, and it's like the baseline strategy you need to employ. And so much of this is, I think, just taking the pressure off all of the other aspects of performance. And what I said about being perfectionist and all that, like none of that matters if you're not actually sitting down to do it. So there's different levels of tactics, but at the beginning, the most important thing is to build space. Make sure you build space for your art. And I think this is a tactic that a lot of people sort of talk about. You need to build a time, a place, and a ritual for you going and sitting down to create stuff, or whatever it is, going to your studio, going to a particular place. And I think in the beginning, we often get really upset because we do. And often this is another thing, is if you haven't drawn for 6 months, then guess what? The first time you do that, your drawings are probably going to suck. If you're not regularly sketching away and drawing, at least like half an hour a day or something like that, you're going to really find that the first time you sit down, which is where all this happens, your drawings suck. Everything sucks. You're all stiff. You're not quite sure. You've kind of forgotten how it all works. It takes a while. It may take a couple of sessions to really kind of get back in the flow. So it's most important to, again, just take that pressure off. And I call this building space. So you literally can set up the time, set up the space, clear it all away, get ready, and again, work on your artistic ritual. There's quite a few videos on the Visual Scholar sort of YouTube channel or in the podcast playlist that really talk about how you can build a ritual. But this is where, you work on your on-ramp. You really make sure that you're clearing away all the other stuff that could trip you up. You got all your beverages, you got all your drinks, you got all the things that are going to make you sit down and then go, oh, wait, no, I need to go do this. You're kind of clearing the decks, you've cleared your desk, you got your sketchbook, you sharpened your pencils, right? Like there's nothing going to stop you. And then you're making sure that you're not dragging the rest of your day into this, right? So for a professional like me, again, I spend most of my days sort of drawing or doing something creative. I need to make sure my ritual allows me not to take the morning, right? Where I'm spending time with sort of other people and doing stuff. I need to have some way to kind of make all of that go away. And that can be a real challenge in the beginning. So clearing the decks, making sure you've got everything ready, and then just sit down. And in the beginning, just sit down for a very short period of time. And I would say like half an hour. And just sit down. And if you do some drawing, that's great. If you don't, that's great. But just, you can't do anything else. This is about building the space for doing it. And this really is just a matter of understanding that if you just sit down, even if you don't do anything, we're just sort of working on chilling out, not stressing about it. You sit down, and then most importantly, when that half an hour is up, you get up and you walk away and you feel good. Why? Because you did what you said you were going to do. You're gaining internal congruency with what you plan to do. and what actually happens when you sit down to do it. So if you're really struggling with like, oh, okay, I start drawing and I don't feel good, and then that makes me feel crummy, and then you have this snowball effect is, okay, well, everyone can sit there and do nothing. Even if it's uncomfortable, you can do it, right? It is within your ability. And just start with a small amount of time. Start with like half an hour and then build up. And just sort of understand, like, yeah, there's not necessarily a pressure to like sit down and create. That's ideal, right? Again, you could move success forward and say, okay, well, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to, I'm going to sketch on this one bit of paper. I'm going to fill it up with scribbles. And if they're terrible scribbles, that's okay. Again, it's just a matter of getting good at setting the expectation of what success means and building that sort of initial feeling of like sitting down and that this being a positive thing, that there's no pressure, there's not feelings of failure, and then that you get up out of it and you finished it. So much of these feelings that from a creative standpoint, and this is where creativity, procrastination, human psychology mix, I think a big part of it is knowing that you're going to sit down, you're going to focus, you're going to do these things. You have a solid outcome in mind, and then you're going to get up and it's going to be over and you can go and engage in other stuff. And I think for people who are really struggling, if you're like used to doing art, you're just like, what are you talking about? Like, why would I not draw art? Like, drawing is the best thing. But in the beginning, this can be a real challenge, right? And often it is the drawer of like those other distractions, the things which are easier, which, you already have a dopamine reaction to, they're going to try and draw you out. But if you just kind of build that habit little bit by bit in the beginning and just build the space for time to draw, then you find that, half an hour later you get up and you be like, I did what I said I was going to do. It wasn't that good, but that's okay, because success is not it being good. Success is me just building space, going through the process. You sit up and then do it again the next day. And I think the more you do that, what you'll find is you're going to be, drawn to do like better drawings. You're like, oh, okay, well, I'm here for half an hour. I've done this a couple of times where I didn't do anything. Now let's just try and draw something. It's okay, because I know it's going to be over in half an hour. And you kind of build up. And I think if you go through that basic strategy, you'll find that it's not long before you're actually drawing, because you do enjoy drawing, because you're an artist and you have a lot of motivation and inspiration, like at some level that you want to do this. And it's just a matter of like opening those gates, right? And opening those energy pathways within yourself so that you sit down, you feel comfortable, you kind of know what's going to happen. It's not this situation where you're sitting down and you feel like, okay, because I've been procrastinating so much, right today I need to draw for 16 hours, straight, like you need to have a good expectation of when this is going to end, and you need to build up. But you'll be able to build up pretty quick. I think if you do that over time, you'll find you're able to sit down for longer. And the other thing is do all those fun things that you want to do, do them anyway, like do them at the end of the day. I think often what people miss is that if you just sit down and really focused for a couple of hours, you're able to achieve a lot. Whereas if you kind of procrastinate and then do 16 hours of really intense work, right at the end of the deadline, that it's probably not very effective work, because you get tired. So that's the first thing from a tactical standpoint, is like build space. Set the expectation of success way back, almost to the point where you feel super confident you can achieve it, and that'll deal with most of those problems initially, right? Because again, it's easy to say, hey, there's a lot of tactical things we can do, but in the beginning, if you're just struggling to even make this a regular thing where you sit down and draw and you sort of develop the ritual, that's where you start. And then you start by just setting the goalposts really low, really easy, and you just build up to it. And again, what you'll find is this is something that I do personally if, I've been taking a break. Sometimes I'll be doing stuff for my sort of professional work that's not really drawing based. I'll be coloring. Sometimes I'll be doing this for a week or more, where I sort of look up and I'm like, I haven't actually drawn for a while. And I notice there's that trepidation of me sitting down. I've been doing creative stuff. I've been thinking about drawing all the time, but I haven't actually sat down to draw. And the tactics that I've developed is just to understand that I have to sit down and I'm just going to do it. I'm going to sit down and put myself there, and I'm going to start drawing for the first half an hour, 1 hour, or 2 hours. And I'm just going to give myself time without feeling pressure and just define success as me sitting down and doing it. So this idea of setting the goalposts, so it's really easy, and just making sure you sit down to sort of engage the creative process, I think is really important, especially when you're trying to, come back from, taking a break. So, no matter where you're at, I think this fundamental idea is really key. Make sure you build space, you get good at protecting that space, and you understand what's required to, just kind of overcome a lot of that friction. And I think, again, what you find for me, the more that I get good at this, if I just kind of know, I haven't drawn for a week or more, if I just kind of set things up right, just set the goalpost really, really far, really sort of easy. And then if I just kind of do it, if I just sit down and draw some stuff and, don't expect anything too big, most of the time I just kind of slip into it, and then it's like, it's fine because there's not that pressure. So much of art, again, is having the right emotional context. And I think not having pressure, being able to go into flow mostly, just dealing with like a small amount of challenge is going to give you the best creative experience. And if you have the best creative experience and you're trying to minimize that friction as you go to sit down, most of the time, everything just kind of turns out fine. All right, let's look at some really basic takeaways here, because this is, some of this is intellectual, some of this is a little bit amorphous. So, how can we sort of break this down? I think if you look firstly at a analytical version of this, I think it's important to understand that procrastination, especially for artists, is a weird mix of things. It's a weird mix of these kind of artistic block things, of kind of subconscious artistic self maybe getting in the way, or maybe bringing up really good points. Like, you haven't drawn for 6 months. If you sit down now, you're going to suck. Don't do it, right? You haven't drawn for 5 days and you've only got an hour here. So, what's the point of even starting? You're probably going to feel miserable, right? You often, again, I think our subconscious knows that we're going to feel miserable if we do this. And if you don't sort of address that, I think it can be challenging. So it is a mix of artistic block, our subconscious artistic self, which I think is a really sort of important thing to pay attention to. And also, not having a clear outcome or a clear goal. Moving the deadlines and putting yourself under pressure, I think, is a great way to give yourself a clear indication of what success means. I think it's often why we do this. And it's only when you get into the habit of just consciously defining success and understanding that, depending on what you're doing, maybe you set the bar for success low, like below perfect. That's fine. Maybe it's not even that you're going to finish something or that it's going to be good. It's just, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to spend 4 hours on this illustration and we'll just see where it goes, right? Again, it's a professional job. I need it done pretty soon. It's not under any crazy pressure, but, instead of saying, I need to finish it, just be like, I'm just going to chill out. I'm just going to work on this for a little bit, whatever it is. And at that point, you stop, you get up, you feel good because you now have internal congruency. You're training yourself to do the things you internally say you're going to do. So a lot of this is matching what we imagine of ourselves, right? Like, I'm the best artist ever, but then I sit down and I can't draw at all, right? It just creates this massive internal conflict. And I think the more you just make these things line up, the version you have of yourself in your mind, like the habits you actually tend to work with, the level of skill you want to achieve versus the level of skill you actually have, how good this thing is likely to be, even if you spend all your time on it. There's a lot of these things that I think if we kind of get them all right and you get more internal congruency, you get into the habit of doing the things you say you're going to do in your own mind, you just feel a lot better about it, right? It becomes less kind of friction, right? There's less kinetic energy building up between those different versions of ourselves. And the last thing is often this is just a matter of the habits of, developing good tactical solutions. And if you do just kind of, again, say to yourself, look, perfect is the enemy of good, or just having it done, or whatever it is, then you just kind of say that to yourself and you're like, okay, yeah, that's right. It doesn't have to be perfect. I'll jump in. Yeah, like whatever works for you. But sometimes that's not going to work for everyone. That is really important to understand. These things are really good, but, you need to find the one that works for you. And also a lot of these other tactical concepts like developing an on-ramp to your ritual, making sure you clear the decks, and making sure that, you've got some things where like, okay, just sit down, just start writing, just start drawing, whatever it is, just get out your sketchbook. Oh, before I start any big project, I always just, start sketching in my sketchbook. Just have fun. Remind yourself why drawing is really good. Often these little tactical things will make a huge difference. So it's a combination, right, of the internal, the artistic mirrors, artistic block, burnout. Like there's a million things that can make you not feel like it. It's also a mix of just not, I think, being clear about where we're going. And also, beating procrastination is often just a matter of really simple, cheap tricks. If you want a simple bro version of this, like the simplest way to say this, I think a lot of it is really about figuring out what you can control. All right, if we look at some practical things you could do. Now, there's a lot of these little tricks where if you just start writing, if you set the expectations super low, it'll get you across the line, right? I think so much of this comes down to that friction point. When you are doing professional jobs like this, give yourself a bit of time in the morning or early on before you really engage and have to deal with this, right? This procrastination friction where I'm going to work on a big job. Just make sure you spend half an hour, 15 minutes, an hour working on some personal work. Start off the day just sketching, loosen up. There's a reason that often people talk about, just starting with a sort of a warm-up sketch. And I think just doing this kind of, reminds you that drawing's fun and it gets you in a good mindset and it stops you kind of thinking about some of the other practical things that can often be really linked to like deadlines, what you're doing, like how good this is. Another really good strategy that I kind of hinted at is to chunk whatever you're doing down. You're meant to kind of sit down and, make this infinite thing. Like often I'll be trying to create some project that probably is going to take me like 3 weeks, or a month before it's really done, and it's a combination of like a whole bunch of different things, like multiple images, multiple illustrations, and it can be really hard to sit down and be like, where do I even start? Like, what's the thing that's actually going to make a difference? So just simply chunking it down and, making a list. This doesn't have to be something where you have project management software or you're doing this fancy. This can just be a scrap of paper and you just write down the steps that you're going to take. And then you say, okay, what's the first thing I need to do? Okay, let's do this. And I found that just breaking things down into steps. Also, if I have a whole bunch of revisions, often with revisions in professional work, I don't really know how long it's going to take, and it seems much bigger than it is. So often if I just write down and put some checkboxes on a scrap bit of paper, like, okay, here's the 10 things I need to fix. I write them down from the client's feedback email or what my art director is saying, and I'm like, okay, I know that I've got all the things I need to do, and I've got a tick box next to them, and I just go through them. And sometimes it takes no time at all. I literally, thought this thing was going to take 5 hours, right? And it takes 10 minutes. So often it's just a matter of starting on those things and just sort of going through it, and having a plan is really good. Also, if you're working on a large illustration or something, just understanding, okay, I'm sitting down not to finish it, but I'm sitting down to start thinking about the initial sketches or the thumbnails, right? Just having a really clear picture of where you want to go is obviously really, really important. Other things that will help, as I said, is build this space. Make sure that your job is to sit down. You don't even have to do anything. I think a lot of, I think Neil Gaiman sort of talked about this in one of his sort of educational things on writing, where he says like, yeah, his rule is he just has to go to a place and he can't do anything else. He doesn't have to write. He just can't do anything else. I think this is a good way to view it, because if you're doing it for that long, you kind of realize sometimes you got nothing, right? But if you just build the habit of sitting down, chilling out, you just can't look on your phone, you can't do stuff you can sit there and do nothing. Often the excitement of making art will beat the boredom. But if you really are stuck, maybe just thinking about it will help. The other thing is just work on your ability to muscle through it. A lot of people find success this way. Just muscle through that friction point, just get going and understand, again, the process is linear, but you can often go back. You can often undo this. And, if it's not some illustration that's going to make or break your career, just understand this is one of many. and it may be the best thing you're going to do. It may not. Who knows? It's very hard to tell, but we get better through doing, through actually putting one foot in front of the other. And if you just start, again, you can go back, you can delete. Often another thing I sort of try and do if I'm working digitally is I'll just start drawing for half an hour and then I'll just undo it, right? Or, you start on a new layer, you work on a whole bunch of stuff, turn off the layer, and if you have made it look worse, start again, right? Again, nothing ventured, nothing gained. It's just a matter of putting one foot in front of the other. Lastly, if we look at a philosophical or a spiritual takeaway, I think the real key thing here is that when I would look at literature that talks about productivity and sort of avoiding procrastination, it often is viewed as this evil habit. And you get kind of called a procrastinator. And it's like you sort of have something that's really wrong with yourself. I think for artists, it's important to understand that many of these things can be really useful. Your subconscious mind is something we need to listen to. It's not like we're doing very menial tasks. The way that you feel about something is very important and is directly connected to how good your performance is likely to be. And sometimes, even though, again, good strategy is just to push through, you have to really think about that, because you have to push through in the right way and you have to understand how you work as an artist, because you do need to have a good emotional outlook on the work you're creating. You do need to kind of be enjoying it. You do need to be having fun. Some people like being under deadline. They like pushing themselves. In which case, I think it's really good to find some way to put yourself under deadline pressure without actually dealing with the actual deadline. It's hard. It's not the same. It's not the same rush. But yeah, I think that can be really, really useful. And I think just appreciating how procrastination is somewhat our subconscious mind telling us kind of what's going to happen. And if you don't have a good expectation, you haven't set good goals, it's going to be very challenging to really get a good result out of that. So whatever works for you, I think, is really going to be useful to think about here and appreciate we're all different when it comes to this, but we all can get over these things. We all do deal with them at different degrees in our career. And mostly it's a matter of understanding and appreciating what's actually happening, that this is not the worst thing in the world, that the way you will overcome it is with some mental gymnastics, with setting good expectations, with really sort of building up your understanding of what's going to happen. And also, just cheap tricks. Cheap tricks are fine. It may seem like you need to solve this with some intellectual sort of deepness. I think that can help. If you're that kind of artist, a lot of people, you just want a cheap trick. It's like, just start writing, just sit down, just do it. That'll work. Or just a simple saying, a simple phrase can work to kind of just get you over the hump. Again, whatever works for you works. We're all unique. And again, I think that's one of the best things about being an artist is you find out a lot about yourself. All right, that's what we got time for on this particular episode. Just wanted to make a really simple, practical, although often for me, again, practical is talking about some of the deeper philosophical aspects of this, but just something that is really aimed at kind of giving you some tools and ideas for how to sort of rethink the idea of procrastination. I know this comes up a lot when I sort of talk to people, especially when you're trying to learn art by yourself or you're trying to build a personal project on the side. If you are a professional, often again, you can be, it's often more frustrating when you're able to perform in one way and then you go and try and do it in another and it just doesn't work, right? If you're quite an adept professional, but you've got this aspirations to make your own stuff and then you kind of get to do it and you're like, I don't want to do it. It's almost more frustrating, right? So again, just understand, even if you're beginning, you feel like you're a complete failure for dealing with this, just to understand everyone deals with this in one way, shape or form. And the more tools you have to develop it, the better you can solve these problems early on, the less likely you're going to deal with them later on. So anyway, super interesting. I think we can learn a lot about the creative process and ourselves through examining the concept of procrastination. I've certainly done that. And let me know if this has helped you along the way. Other than that, I'll catch you around on the next one.